One of Australia's more recent arrivals is Tim Soutphommasane. He was born in France of Chinese and Lao extraction and arrived in Australia as a child. He's now the country's Race Discrimination Commissioner and a member of the Australia Day Council. Tim Soutphommasane, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Australia is a polyglot nation, to say the least. How should the community celebrate Australia Day in the second decade of the 21st century?
Australia is a diverse country, and our celebrations on Australia Day will necessarily reflect that. There's more than one way to celebrate the National Day. Indeed, some may not feel like celebrating at all. Many will feel that it's an occasion not so much to celebrate, but to reflect on how Australia is doing as a country and where Australia can do better. But we are talking about a country whose population is very pluralistic. 45% of Australians were either born overseas or are the children of migrants, and that will be reflected in the way that people will celebrate on the 26th of January.
You have written that patriotism is a love of country where you can fly your flag on the inside, quote unquote. What's wrong with proudly flying the flag?
Well, there's nothing wrong with flying the flag. It's a healthy thing to express national pride, provided that it doesn't target people unfairly for how they look or where they come from. Unfortunately, what we do see today with contemporary expressions of Australian patriotism is something of a dark side. It can often be accompanied by jingoism, some would say even racism, and that's a very dangerous thing to have in a multicultural society. National symbols should be something that can unite Australians rather than divide them. And in the past decade or so, we have seen people draw on national symbols and national pride to exclude people who don't look like the majority or who aren't one of us, for want of a better phrase.
On that question of division, the issue of asylum seekers has been especially divisive in Australia in recent years, and yet it is some of the country's newest citizens who are most antagonistic to irregular arrivals. How does the nation address that paradox?
Australia has traditionally been a very open and generous country when it comes to immigration. Australian society has been transformed since post-war migration began. And when you think of what Australia looks like in 1947-48, when 90% of people would have been Anglo-Celtic in ethnic or cultural composition to the Australia that you have today, that says a lot about the Australian character. Unfortunately, we haven't always expressed that open and generous nature towards those who are near arrivals, and the language that has been used in discussing asylum seekers, particularly those who arrive by boat, is unedifying. The talk of illegal immigrants doesn't do justice to the fact that most of those who come here seeking sanctuary are ultimately proven to be refugees. We need to be very careful about the impact of inflammatory language on our social cohesion and racial harmony. We've come a long way in combating racism and having an open, liberal, democratic society. Now is not the time to undo the good work of past decades.
Human Rights Watch has accused the Australian government of demonising asylum seekers. You too have used just the same adjective. Does that mean you think the government is contributing to that demonisation?
The language we use is very important in how we regard others. Quite frankly, not everyone will make a distinction between an asylum seeker, a refugee, an international student, a skilled migrant, a second or third generation Australian, or indeed an Indigenous Australian. I've had reports from various community groups about how Indigenous Australians have been told to go back to where they came from. That suggests that you can have an indiscriminate hostility towards anyone who doesn't look like they're a member of the majority on this, and that is a real good reason for us to exercise extreme care in the language that we use in discussing asylum seekers. And that applies not only to political leaders but to citizens and members of Australian society in everyday life and in their everyday interactions as well.
What about this then? You have also written that we must not underestimate the consequences of invoking fear or, as has been happening recently, employing the language of war, also quote unquote. it's the government which has militarised the people smuggling operation. You are having a shot at the government, are you not?
Well, the government has used that language. I don't think the language is acceptable. And if the language is picked up by Australian society, then that can have very grave consequences for how people get treated in their everyday lives. Australians value a fair go. We should ensure that we extend the fair go to everyone and not just to some.
Another issue, Australia Day is a particularly sensitive moment for Indigenous Australians. It marks the instant they no longer have the continent to themselves. How well has Australia managed to make Australia Day a moment for the Indigenous community to celebrate rather than to commiserate?
There's no question that the 26th of January is a very complex day given its history. It perhaps will always have an ambivalence. There may well be a time in the future when Australia has occasion to use a different date as its national day. But for now, we are stuck with the 26th of January. I think Australia can be very mature in the way that it handles questions of nationhood. We can have a healthy and respectful debate on the 26th of January, and it's all right to respect those who don't believe that it's a day for celebration as well. For me, the 26th of January should be a day for both celebration and reflection. It should be an occasion for us to think about how we can do better to ensure Australia lives up to the best of its traditions, and also to find ways that we can right old wrongs. The kind of patriotism I would like to see on the 26th of January is one that is generous, inclusive and sometimes, if necessary, critical.
Soutphommasane, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Real pleasure, Jim.